Hi, this is Tom Rhodes. Please join me as I scour the four corners of the earth to bring you interesting and intelligent, funny people who will enrich your life with wisdom and laughter. I'll take you to Europe, Australia, all over America. I might take you to the peaks of Machu Picchu, the canals of Amsterdam, the Great Wall of China, or the swamps of Florida, and certainly the many, many comedy clubs and comedy theaters all over the world. Come hang out with me and meet the many interesting people that pop up in my life as I travel the world as a stand-up comedian.
You're listening to Tom Rhodes Radio.
Karate kick, baby.
Rock and roll.
My Uncle Bob is dead. I got a text message a few days ago. Apparently it came very fast. He had throat cancer, and he found out, and he was dead a few weeks later. It's so fucked up that my Uncle Bob is dead now because it exposes myself to me that I'm a hypocrite and I'm an asshole because I have not spoken to my Uncle Bob in a few years since my sister died. I'm the guy who's constantly saying, tell the people you love that you love them. And there's that paragraph from the book Shantaram that I always quote about the choice between forgiveness and hating can become the story of your life. I don't want to go into too many personal details because this is very much a family matter, but hate and anger can consume your life, and you think you're fine with the world, but you realize you fucked up, and I certainly fucked up when it comes to my Uncle Bob. My Uncle Bob is the brother of my father, and I love my dad more than anyone. And for whatever reason, my Uncle Bob did not speak to my dad for the last 10 years that he was alive. And I would sit with my dad when I was still drinking, and I would hear my dad. He was absolutely heartbroken. He couldn't figure out why his brother wanted nothing to do with him. So when my dad died, it's interesting. This conversation was recorded in July 2009, and my father died in November 2009, and that's when my anger towards my uncle started to boil. And then in April 2011, my sister died of cancer, and I saw my uncle at my sister's funeral, and that's when I guess I chose not to speak to him anymore because I thought it was really cruel that he did not speak to my father. And also, my sister had cancer for 4 years, and I guess I didn't like that he did not come visit my sister. And my Uncle Bob lived in Florida for years. We used to see him all the time. He was very encouraging and always there for me when I started doing stand-up. But then he and his wife moved to Vermont, and I think 2007. And then we didn't have any contact with him. And, as bad as I feel about this, communication is a two-way street. And he didn't reach out to me. I guess we were both cowards in that regard. He didn't communicate with our family. He didn't communicate with me. And then I just stopped communicating with him. And I was angry at my uncle for, I don't know, I just felt like he kind of gave up on our family or something. And that's probably certainly not the truth. But, sometimes in life, crazy shit gets into your head, and then you just think it's the truth. It's so fucked up now that he's dead. like all these great memories of him have flooded into my head. He lived with us in Florida for 3 years when I was, when I was a very young teenager, and Bob was my hero in life. And I'll never forget when I'd been to comedy for like 10, 15 years. My uncle, he was a delivery man for FedEx. He had a great career. He met his wife working for FedEx, and then he ended up retiring, and he and his wife moved to Vermont. And I'll never forget, like, I had been on comedy for years, and I would complain about things or whatever, made him make this observation, but I always thought this was such a great observation that he made. He said, he goes, Tom, no matter how hard you think comedy is, just remember that me, as a FedEx delivery man, when I show up somewhere to deliver a package, no one applauds. As a comedian, you start your job to applause. So I always thought that was a great reminder of being appreciative of what you have in life. I'm ashamed that I didn't expect the guy to die. I really thought that, one day we would eventually work things out. And you don't have that luxury in life. And I think that's why young people are happy, because the people they love have not died. And then when you get older, people you love die, and you realize that, life is a fragile thread, and anyone can be plucked at any minute. I mean, apparently he went very quick, and he did not smoke, never smoked, which is really interesting that he would die of throat cancer. There was I'm going to replay this episode. This is episode number 2 of my podcast that I ever did. Started doing my podcast in 2009. In July 2009, I was invited to do the Just for Laughs Comedy Festival in Montreal. I flew in 2 days early with Ashna. We rented a car, and we drove down to Vermont. And my uncle lived about a half hour, 45 minutes outside of Montpelier. And it was this beautiful green wood and mountainous area. And he was so happy, and my Uncle Bob had a very tough childhood, as did my dad. And I would have to say that his life was a victory. He had a great career. He found a woman who loved him, and they retired to Vermont. And they bought like a little farm, and there was, in the backyard, you could see this valley. And what's interesting I listened to this episode, and, I want to play it to honor my Uncle Bob, who was such a huge influence on me. And I'm ashamed I haven't spoken to him since April 2011. And that's what makes me an all-time fucking asshole. But I was still drinking. And it was funny, when I started doing the podcast, I had a microphone, like a handheld microphone that you would use in a comedy club, and I plugged it into my computer. And it was funny, so I would, I'd ask a question, and then I'd pass it to my guest. In this episode, it's my uncle. And I'm drunk. You can tell that I'm a little boozy. And that was the intention of my podcast when I first started it. I thought, I'll be drinking with people. We'll be hanging out like life, So it's funny to hear it now, after I haven't drank in 4 years. I'm like, oh my God, I'm asking very long questions, and I ask him a lot of questions about me and how he felt about me doing comedy. I had just started doing the podcast, and my uncle and I both were very self-centered people. So now that he's dead, I wish I would have asked him more about himself. And, he loved movies, and he had all this different knowledge, as does everyone. but it's interesting. This was the second episode of my podcast I ever recorded, and at that time, at the beginning, I was in I forget however many of the beginning episodes, I would slice in stand-up comedy. I thought that would be cool to have a podcast, and then you play comedy bits in the interview. So there's an interview, there's a stand-up clip with me. There's this Bill Murray song that pops up 3/4 through the way. There is one mistake for like 2 minutes. The metronome is knocking. You'll be able to hear that. And then at the end, there's like a B.B. King song that gets layered in underneath while Bob is giving me this great advice. But I tried to make a documentary years ago, and I filmed an interview with my uncle. I filmed an interview with my dad, and I did an interview with my sister Laura. And even though the documentary, nothing ever became of it, it's invaluable, the money that I spent, because I captured these people that I love for eternity. And in this conversation with my Uncle Bob, you'll be able to hear great things about his personality. My Uncle Bob had this fantastic laugh. He had the most beautiful laugh. And then he had this kind of sinister laugh where he would get really high, like, and that always cracked me up, that this kind of devilish, high-pitched laugh that he would do sometimes. He would say the words, "and so forth," sometimes. And I remember Aniek, the Dutch girl that I moved to Holland for, I remember after her and I had visited my Uncle Bob, her and I would say that. We'd pepper conversations with "and so forth," the way my uncle would. And I'll never forget, after she dumped me and I was moving out of her apartment, when I moved out of her apartment in Amsterdam, and it was just that final day. You're looking at the relationship, that it's those last words you're saying to each other. And she asked me how I felt, and I said, "There's nothing left to say except for Merry Christmas and so forth." And it was not Christmas. And I put that story in my book. I need to write more about my uncle for my book, because now that he's dead, I've been flooded with all these memories. Oh, and then also you're going to hear him do this Irish accent. My Uncle Bob Ryan, doesn't get any more Irish than that. He was obsessed with Irish culture and Ireland, and he would always do this Irish accent. "Top of the morning." And I always wanted him to come and to go to Ireland. And I've played in Ireland once a year for 20 years, and I always told him, "You should come and see me when I'm in Ireland." And he never did. It's kind of heartbreaking that the man never made it to Ireland. And it was so much a part of his identity. So it's truly heartbreaking. But I'm happy that I recorded this. I'm happy that you can hear his voice. And fuck, I mean, I still have issues with my brother. I haven't spoken to my brother in a few years. And you just think you have all this time in life, and then you're mad at somebody and you're not speaking to them, and they drop dead, and then you're never going to get that back. And my Uncle Bob, he tried to be a novelist. He was obsessed with horror. And that was one thing I didn't like when I was a kid and a teenager, especially when he was living with us. He used to scare the shit out of me. And I always hated that he was, and to this day, I don't like horror. And it was one of the things he loved. And it's interesting because now I will forever be haunted by the fact that I did not make it right with my uncle. I mean, it's a two-way street. It's easy to beat yourself up, but I mean, wow, it's so fucked up that the man is dead now, and I'll never get to have another conversation with him. One of the happy memories that popped into my head after he died a few days ago, I'll never forget. I was like in my 30s, and I was visiting him, and the James Taylor song came on, like the oldies radio or whatever we were listening to. The shower the people you love with love, show them the way that you feel. So my Uncle Bob, he was hugging me, and he was singing that song to me. Shower the people you love with love, show them the way that you feel. And God damn it, I would give anything to have that moment back right now and just tell my Uncle Bob, I'm sorry, Bob. I love you. I'm sorry that I did not speak to you for so long. So, this is my Uncle Bob Ryan, Robert Ryan. He was a great man. His life was a victory. He had a beautiful love story with a woman who loved him back. And we recorded this in his backyard in Vermont after we watched the sunset go down over the valley. I know right now this massive, like third nor'easter this winter is hitting the Northeast, and Vermont is covered in fucking ice, and it's cold, and it's nasty, and the people who were there around him, who loved him, are in pain and heartbroken. This memory and this recording is right after the sunset. He built a fire. I was still smoking cigarettes. You can hear my Zippo lighter flick a couple times. But we were drinking beer, we were drinking wine, and we had this wonderful conversation in his backyard. And I hope you enjoy this conversation. I love you, Bob, and I'm sorry. Hello, darling listeners. This is Tom Rhodes. This clip you're going to hear, I did the Montreal Comedy Festival this year, and I flew in 3 days early because my favorite uncle, Bob, my Uncle Bob, moved to Vermont about 2 years ago. And I haven't seen him in 2 years, and he's actually the reason I do stand-up comedy. I saw him when I was 12. He did open mic nights for a year, and he's a great guy. And we had a really long talk in his backyard after we watched the sunset.
You're listening to Tom Rhodes Radio.
Karate kick, baby.
Rock and roll.
I think that Bob Ryan is one of my favorite human beings on the planet. And you're my favorite uncle. And I think it's like, you know, a lot of people have written me emails or come up to me after shows through the years, and they've said, you know, you're my favorite comedian.
Right.
And I've always really, I always thought, wow, that's a really special thing to be someone's favorite comedian.
Uh-huh.
But beyond that, within your family, to be, you know, everyone has their favorite uncle, and you're my favorite uncle, and you have inspired me in so many ways, and you're into literature and comedy, and you're a novelist, and you did comedy, and, you know, it may have only been for a year, but God damn it, you did it, and you were a comedian, and you are a novelist, and you are a thinker, and you're an open-minded, intellectual guy who has a magnificent sense of humor, and you've been one of the most greatest influences on my life. And I would not be the person that I am today if it was not for Bob Ryan.
Let me say something in that regard. You know, Tom has been singing my praises, and I love him dearly for that. And, and it's nice to hear that, you know, I was a positive influence in somebody's. It's nice to hear it because you hope that you are, and you never know or whatever. But it's to hear somebody say the words is actually nice. But I just want to say something for all the listeners out there. If anybody who's listening to this, and I assume that anybody who's listening to this is a fan of Tom Rhodes, and let's say loves Tom Rhodes. So if you love Tom Rhodes and his act and everything, then I'm happy that you remember that I'm his favorite uncle. But if you fucking hate him and can't stand his comedy or whatever, and you're just listening out of some perverse weird shit, forget you ever knew me, man. Forget the name Bob Ryan. Okay.
Oh. No, but the point is, I would not be the person that I am today if it wasn't for my favorite Uncle Bob, and I am sitting in his magnificent backyard in Vermont. The stars are sparkling. We've got a beautiful little fire burning next to my glowing MacBook computer, and we're passing the microphone back and forth. Our family is from Washington, D.C. I was born in Washington, D.C., as were you and my brothers and my father, your brother. And there is a certain amount of blackness that our family has and that our family has always celebrated. I've always thought we were the blackest white family in America.
That's right.
And I kind of take pride in that.
That's right.
I really like the jazziness in the way we speak and the rhythm. And, I mean, what do you think? Was that just being in a predominantly black city that made that happen? Or why do you think our family celebrates black culture subconsciously so much?
Well, being around so many black folks in D.C., there's no question that's the major reason that happened. We grew up and, kind of somewhat lower middle class or whatever when I grew up, which meant we were kind of like on the poorer side, whitey side of town or whatever. I was talking about this with my childhood buddy from the time I was 12 or 10, came up to visit me, and we lived in the neighborhood in southeast Washington, D.C., Anacostia. And we were basically, I've thought about this since then, we were always right on the edge of the black neighborhood. And so there was a little bit of overlap there, where I would hang with on a street corner, sometimes when I was 10 or something, and listen to black dudes tell stories and so forth. Later on, they would always like hurt each other's feelings or, put each other down, but it was a joking cultural thing they did. Later, they called it playing the dozens, but back in those days, before that, it was called joning. You were joning on somebody, I hate to talk about your mama. She's a sweet old soul. I can't even tell that. Probably even on the podcast, it's too crude and rotten to tell. But,
please. You tell the worst mom joke, and I'll tell the worst mom joke.
Well, here's the things that shape your worldview. Now, I apologize ahead of time to any delicate sensibilities, but here's the kind of thing that in our neighborhood where we grew up, you say, how did we get blackness or whatever? Well, it's because I was 9, 10 years old hanging on the street corner with black dudes from down the street, 17 years old or whatever, and they would just hang on the street corner and joan, see who could hurt each other's feelings the worst or whatever, called joning, later called play the dozens. And here's the kind of stuff that gets in your head from the time you're like 9. I'm just sitting there looking kind of almost in awe at the black dude, and he goes, let me tell you something, man. I hate to talk about your mama. She's a sweet old soul. She got a tin can pussy and a rubber asshole. She got knives on the titties to open the door. She got hairs on the pussy to sweep the floor. Okay? Now that's wrong on so many levels. In today's politically correct, this was how it was, man. Yeah. And in today's politically correct world, you couldn't even begin to think that or say it or whatever,
Well, fuck today's...
Because it's wrong.
Fuck today's politically correct world. The best insult I ever heard on... putting down someone's mother is your mother's pussy is so dry that the crabs carry canteens. Wow, that's dry.
Right. Yeah.
But now, I don't think there's any. I've never heard that story. You telling about being 9 and listening to the black people in the corner, because I love Hank Williams, and Hank Williams, the greatest country superstar ever. I worship him. Actually, your mother, my grandmother, is why I love Hank Williams. She loved Hank Williams, and that's how I got turned on to him. But I read his biography, and I know a lot about him. He listened. There was a black man in Montgomery, Alabama, that sat on the corner and played guitar, and he wanted him to teach him guitar, and would actually give him his quarter. If his parents would give him money to go get candy, and he'd give it to the black man to teach him how to play guitar. So there is something to that. I do remember a story that you told me. You were working in a warehouse or something when you were a teenager with all these African-American gentlemen.
Yes, Nubian gentlemen, you might say. Nubian brothers.
And there was a certain thing that they would say on payday. And I believe it went, dick hard, balls smoking, I need some pussy and I ain't joking.
Absolutely. That's one of the crudest things ever uttered, but it's the coin of the realm.
Wait. But I want you to elaborate on that memory, but also I want you to I want you to also take that further into the historic part of Washington D.C. history that don't remember. My parents met at Anacostia High School.
That's right.
And you grew up in Anacostia,
That's
which
correct.
Today, and for at least 30 years now, has been one of the blackest areas of the United States.
Right.
I think our family was a part of the white flight. When a black family moved in, the whites all moved to the suburbs. So you're growing up in a neighborhood that became eventually one of the blackest areas
and crime-ridden
in America.
Yes.
What are your memories of that time when it went from white to black?
I have a lot of vivid memories, and again, I was talking to my best childhood buddy who lived through that we're talking about he and I when we were 10, 11, 12, 13, in that era right there. And this would have been in the early 60s, let's say, from 60 to 64, that kind of an era. We were talking about it, and I've realized since then that this was when, black folks were starting to, the revolution was starting to gain some momentum. You know what I mean? It was the time of Martin Luther King. There was a lot of change in the air and so forth, much needed, long overdue, but there was that Black Power movement was just starting to happen, the militant aspect of it. Like, motherfucker, we had enough of this bullshit and we ain't gonna take it no more. You ain't gonna hold us down no goddamn more. So the movement was beginning to start. Well, Fred and I are 10, 11, and 12, and where we lived in Anacostia, we were right on the edge of the black neighborhood. So what I realized now, as I thought about it later in life, was Freddie and I were on the front lines of where the civil rights clash began, where the black neighborhood kept moving further out of the black neighborhood and into the white neighborhood. And we were literally right on the edge of that. I mean, physically, that's where our neighborhood was located in D.C., in Anacostia. And so we were on the front lines of the civil rights clash when it was just starting to begin, which means we got a lot of black fists swung at our motherfucking heads. Fred and I, we went down to the corner to the sub shop where we used to go all the time. It's called Miles Long on Nichols Avenue. Is now Martin Luther King Avenue in D.C. And we would go down to Nichols Avenue at the bottom of the hill there, and we would for years we'd gone down, and it was a sub shop, hoagies and whatnot. We would get subs at Miles Long, and one time, the black folks had started to move into our neighborhood, and we went down there, and we almost got our ass beat. Freddie had on a new pair of Chucks, Chuck Taylor high top black shoes, and the dude outside was waiting for him and said, "Motherfucker, give me them shoes." So that's the kind of thing that was going on. There was a lot of hostility and all of that kind of stuff or whatever. But, and I want to clarify one thing I've thought about too. People refer to white folks moving out of those neighborhoods as black folks moved in.
White flight.
It's referred to as white flight. I'd like to reterm that. That wasn't no white flight, motherfucker, because I lived through it, dude. I was there. You wasn't even born yet. Let me tell you something. That was white goddamn common sense. That wasn't no motherfucking white flight. Because that makes it sound like, oh, man, the black man is coming. We better run for no good reason. No, there was plenty of good reason. Them motherfuckers hated us. You can argue what you want. Maybe there was some justification for what had been done to them, but they didn't deserve to hate me, motherfucker. I hadn't done nothing. Okay? So they was coming at my motherfucking head, busting me upside the head and shit for no reason. So it wasn't white flight. It was like, God damn, if we want to survive, these motherfuckers are going to try and kill us. We are going to move. So that's what that was all about. So, yeah, that's what went down. But, I mean, I could go on and on with incidents about like the hostility, man, and things that were going on. That's why there's a couple things that I reflect on about that. When I get politically incorrect or make my commentary about, black folks and whatever, and I don't do it with any animosity in my heart, and truly in my heart, and I'm not a racist. I've had black friends and so forth. But when you comment on that era that I lived through in Southeast D.C., I feel like I'm entitled to talk about it because, I was in the trenches. I was on the front line. So it's not, some white boy from Montgomery County or some white commentator sitting by his computer writing a column or an article, a theoretical article about race relations and how they ought to be. And he's discussing it in the safety and sanctity of his office. And he's never lived or hung out with a black person in his life. And I was there, dude. I worked at, you talked about earlier, the D.C. Public School Warehouse. I used to work there. Me and a buddy of mine were the only two white guys. There were nothing but black guys there. And that story you told is one of my favorites. Every day, we got off at 4 o'clock. So there were like about 30 or 40 guys that worked in this warehouse. And me and this other guy were the only two white dudes. And so we'd all gather and throng together to punch out at the time clock. And we got off at 4. So everybody would start gathering at the time clock at 3:57, poised with their time card so they could get punched out right at 4. So in these 3 minutes while we're waiting to punch out, everybody be talking, and talking shit through the crowd or whatever. And it was always, in every neighborhood I was ever in, black dudes always have nicknames. And there was always a guy named Tootie, and he might have a little bit of a gravelly voice. And I remember just repeating that anecdote you told earlier. Somebody yelled, there's a crowd, all these mingled voices, and everybody's talking at once, and I heard somebody yell, "Hey, Tootie, man, Friday night, what you gonna do?" And Tootie said, "I don't know, man. All I know is dick hardball smoking, need some pussy, and ain't joking." Which was one of the coolest things I ever heard. But anyway, so what I'm saying is, having lived in the midst of all that, dude, I'm entitled, I know whereof I speak, okay? And so I have friends, and listen, man, I want all of us to come together and the whole racism thing and all of us to love each other and all of that to be over with and done. Racism and all that stuff is a horrible, it's the biggest cancer that's eaten our country, since its inception, and it's got to go away and it's got to stop. But at the same time, I'm sitting here talking to my comedian nephew, and goddamn it, you got to be honest. You got to tell the truth, man, or it's all bullshit.
Last time I was in Texas, I met a white supremacist dude. Are there any white supremacists here? They never go out to the fucking clubs, man. How are you gonna reach these people? What a silly concept, man. A white master race. Does anybody fucking believe that? I mean, anybody who ever studied biology knows the more you mix a genetic code, the stronger our immune systems will become to fight diseases, and we'll all actually live longer as a people if you mix the races. Keep mixing the races until we're all the same grayish color. And there'll be no more racism once we're all the same shade, man. Hey, gray. Who you calling gray? Then we'll actually be able to hate someone for the person that they are. Yes. Envision the day when you could hate someone just because he's an asshole. What freedom. I guess it's easy for me to say mix the races because I'm a bunch of different races. And I lived in New York City for the last couple of years, and they always have these ethnic day parades, man. And I admit it, I got envious, I'd watch these parades and go, maybe one day my people. You never see a parade for me. You never see a quarter English, quarter French, quarter Italian, quarter don't know what the fuck you really are parade. Hey, it's the confused bastard honky day parade. I'm a quarter everything. My ancestors fucked about everybody. I wish I had some melanin so I don't burn so bad at the beach. Oh, thank you for getting that. Thank you. Do that in the Midwest, they never get that part of it. Could you put a dictionary at the foot of the stage, please? Everyone should know what melanin is. I think that's where racism comes from, man. White people are jealous of people with melanin. Think about it, man. It comes from thousands of years of white people getting sunburnt at the beach. That's where all the hatred started. White people getting pink and flaky and crispy and ow, ow, don't touch me, ow, shit. People with melanin don't have this problem. I'll give them lower wages. It's the media, huh? Don't you agree? Yeah. The media controls all the information we receive. You think I'm lying? Whatever happened to Somalia? Weren't they starving to death, man? A couple years ago? Now you don't hear nothing about Somalia. Well, I guess they're full. I guess you go to Somalia now and there's Snickers wrappers everywhere. Everybody's sucking on a toothpick. I'm stuffed. Remember a couple years ago, every night on TV, skinny bald-headed people starving, remember? God, it was so hard to enjoy a large pizza back then. Oh, shit, look at that guy, man. He's got fucking, turn the channel, shit. Oh, he's got flies all over his face. It's not funny, man, come on. Oh, wait a minute, there's titties in the background. Look at the titties. Look at the titties. I love titties. Can I say that? Can I come out of the closet? I am a titty lover. I was in Australia. There was a wonderful picture in the newspaper. While I was there, Queen Elizabeth from England was visiting with her husband, Prince Philip. And there was a picture in the paper. They were somewhere in Australia watching some Aboriginal tribal dance, and the women were all dancing and they didn't have any tops on, right? And the Queen had this serious, queenie look on her face. And right next to her was Prince Philip going, titties.
What do you remember from your brief but very impactful experience as a stand-up comedian when you were starting that year? What were your feelings? What I mean, your anxieties, or anything? Just even the club that I saw you perform at. What memories of your experience as a comedian do you remember?
This would have been the late 70s.
I believe 1978.
1978.
If I'm not mistaken.
Yes. So this would have been 1978. And
so actually I would have been 11, not 12.
Okay. So 1978, being a comedian was not on my radar ever at that point. I had never thought of that. That just wasn't anything that happened. What I was like, I was always a funny dude. I mean, I was one of those guys that just had a good sense of humor and would always make people laugh at parties and so forth. And I had a little bit of a flair for doing voices and impressions or whatever. I never really worked on them, so they were so-so, whatever. But anyway, so in D.C., in Southeast D.C., there was a little bar that had been there forever, and it was kind of a redneck bar. It was on Minnesota Avenue in D.C., and actually it was on Pennsylvania Avenue in Southeast D.C., and it was called L. Brookman's. And it was just a little local bar, barflies and so forth. And on the weekends, they would have country music. And so their son, Paul Brookman, I think his name was, he was going to he was first couple years of college, community college. And he and a buddy said, let's try comedy on the weekends, like Friday night or whatever. So the rednecks, if you will, were coming there expecting to see country music, and suddenly, at least one night a week, as I recall, was Friday nights, was comedy night, open mic night. the country band was sort of pushed aside. You might go up and their instruments would still be on the stage or whatever. They weren't performing that night, and so the audience the regular audience was kind of resentful of that at first, because it's like, hey man, you're taking over our club or whatever. So anyway, it was just an experiment that these two college dudes thought up, and at the time, there was no comedy revolution in America. There weren't this chain of clubs that suddenly, that we're familiar with now, that exploded then from the late 70s and into the 80s and all of that, when there was comedy clubs everywhere. That was the very beginning. I'm not saying, we were the inventors of it or whatever, but nevertheless.
You were certainly at the forefront.
Absolutely.
I think only New York City, Washington, D.C., maybe Los Angeles and Chicago were probably the only places like that had comedy clubs. Or not comedy clubs, but places that did comedy at that time.
That's right. But to my knowledge, obviously I don't know what was going on in New York and those other cities, but in D.C., to my knowledge, there was nobody before L. Brookman's, because the only places I ever, and I was kind of hip to comedians, I'd go see them and so forth, and I was always interested in them. But anyway, the only comedy places were nightclubs where established comedians would come to perform, like Richard Pryor or something. But the Cellar Door was a big comedy venue and everything. But if they were out there, I had never heard of them. And I was hip. I was into the scene, so I kind of knew what was going on. So anyway, suddenly one of my buddies, and it might have been George Wilbur, the guy I was telling you about, one of my buddies from the Wild Dog days, came up to me and said, Bob Ryan, did you hear there's doing comedy on the weekend, on Friday nights at L. Brookman's? I said, nah, get out of here. And whatever, and they said, you should go do that. I said, no, you're crazy. Get out of here, whatever. And so they talked me into it. They said, you're funny, go do this. And I remember being initially so inhibited about it that a buddy of mine, the first time I went up on stage, a buddy of mine, he had like a wicker trash basket. And the trash basket had a lid on it. But it was like designed, it was made to look like a bird, this wicker straw thing. So the lid on the basket had like a little beak and eyes on it and everything. And so to sort of like hide or get the nerve to get up on stage, the very first time I walked up, I had that on my head. So now that's the equivalent of a dude putting the lampshade on his head or some shit, So I went up on stage with the bird, and I don't remember what jokes I told or whatever. And so like every Friday night, I would go down there, and you and I have talked about this one part of it before, Tom. I had no idea how stand-up comedy was supposed to be done. I had no idea. How could you know? And so I actually thought that you had to almost like reinvent your act every week. I believed that you couldn't tell the same jokes over and over. They'd be stale or whatever. So every week I was trying to come up with like 5 or however many minutes of brand new material, And now I've since discovered that that's not the way it works. That's not the way it works. If you find a joke that works, keep it. It's not like all the same 75 people are going to be there who heard it before. That's how naive I was. But I remember being back in the kitchen and you had just thought up the jokes and crudely written them out. You had performed on Friday, and then like by Monday or Tuesday or something, in between bongs and whatnot, you had managed to clear your head long enough to like write some stuff down or think up, oh, maybe that's funny. Hasn't ever been tried. You don't know if it's any good, if it's going to bomb or whatever. And so I would be trying to memorize it even when I was standing in the kitchen waiting to go on.
That's classic. The best joke that I had that I can remember from that period was, because as a comedian, you can only talk about what you know and your experiences. And my experiences when I started when I was 17 and 18 was borrowing my dad's car and going on dates and trying to get laid. Mm-hmm. And I remember my most killer joke from when I started was on a date with a girl, and we're parked in my dad's Chrysler LeBaron, and we're smooching, and I make the move, and I unbutton her pants, and she pushes my arm away, and she says, if I do anything with you, what's it going to mean? Mm-hmm. I said, well, for you, a ride home.
I remember that joke quite distinctly. Yeah.
That joke used to kill. That was like, I think that was my closer when I was like 17.
Yeah.
But now you've seen me many times through the years. I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
Well, don't forget that thought, but I was just going to throw in one more joke just for the hell of it. Not necessarily one of my favorites, but one that just popped into mind. A good joke was something about Kojak or Telly Savalas or something with a turtleneck or something like that. You remember that joke?
Oh, something about my penis.
Penis or
something about a
condom
penis
joke or
looked like Telly Savalas with a turtleneck.
some shit.
That
like
was
that
the
or whatever.
descriptive.
Yeah. Okay.
It's all about the details in comedy.
That's right.
Yeah.
So
I remember that. All I can remember is the joke was referring to a penis,
Of course.
or my penis, and then it looked like Telly Savalas with a turtleneck. Yeah.
Which
Which way? Hey, come on. When you're 17, that's
even today
that's pretty fucking poetic.
it is. But if you were to do like a statistical study of all comedians' material, probably 67% of it has to do with genitals. But anyway, that's just an aside. Go ahead.
But now you saw me from my earliest inclinations as a comedian, and through the developing years, and you've seen me in many places,
Absolutely.
all over the world.
Well, not the world so much, but certainly the country.
All over the United States.
A lot of parts of it, yeah.
So, when did you think I first started to get a grasp on it as a comedian, or what stories can you tell our fortunate listeners about Tom Rhodes in the earliest years?
I remember, I don't remember the specific night per se, but I remember when it finally kind of clicked on in my head that your part of your question was like, did you feel like you had a handle on it when you had arrived, so to speak, as a comedian? And I think it was about 10 years into it. I remember, because you see you from the very beginning, and what would happen is, and I'm sure this is probably pretty much applies to any comedian, but it seems to me that to be a comedian, you just get up there and you keep doing it, and you fight your way through the rejection and the heckling, and you kind of just learn, because there is no instruction manual on how to do this, You get up there and you keep doing it, and you learn what works and you learn what doesn't work. But a part of it is you want to, you're trying almost too hard, beginning comedians, to get them to like you. You want them to like you, to be on your side or whatever. So maybe you do, I'm not saying you per se, but comedians in general will do stuff that's phony or pandering or trying to be ingratiating or trying to be loved. And it's not them, or whatever. But not only that, but you have to, somewhere along the line, you have to continually be trying out jokes. And it's like, flying, it's like being on a tightrope without a net. You throw it out there and you don't know if it's going to work or not until you try it on stage. And so you weed your way through. It's watching you weed your way through some jokes that aren't so great and some that are good, and the keepers, and the material gradually gets tighter and better, and you get smoother. I'm talking about you watching this happen, the evolution of your career. And so I would watch this, and sometimes you might be trying too hard, or the material would be hit or miss or whatever. And it would be, when I say trying too hard, it's almost like, just trying too hard to please the audience or something, instead of like just going with material that you felt from the heart or whatever. And so, but anyway, and so there was, around the edges, there might be a little bit of a nervousness or an insecurity or something, some little thing. But after it seemed like to me about 10 years that I said, this dude is down. You know what I mean? He's got it. He's there. He's a solid, rock solid professional. His material is airtight. Not every joke is going to kill every person. One of my expressions that I have is, in life, nobody bats 1,000 ever in anything. So, you're going to win some, you're going to lose some. It's going to be hit or miss or whatever. But as a solid professional comedian, anyway, that's kind of the answer to your question. I felt like, seeing you off and on for and not to say that the previous 10 years was chopped liver by any means. You were killing and doing well and so forth. But watching it from not just any casual audience member, but an uncle who has been so close to you and to the inner workings of your soul and your mind and your heart and whatever, and knowing what's true and what's real and all of that kind of stuff, I would sit there and go, okay, we're going from 1 star to 2 stars to 3 stars or whatever. But it was 10 years. And would you say, and I would ask you back this part of that, would you say that's a pretty fair rule of thumb for most comedians when they're learning how to become a solid professional and work their way up to a headliner? Would you say 5 to 10 years is about what it might take to get there?
No, actually, I'm flattered that you say 10 years because most young comedians, when I'm talking to them and they're asking me these types of questions, I tell them I was about at the 13-year mark.
Where you yourself?
Before I really thought in my own mind that I had a handle on it.
Okay.
But I do think that it takes 10 years, certainly, for anybody. It took me a couple extra.
Right.
I started out on the southern circuits and some of the toughest gigs in the world. But, yeah, I thought it was about at the 13-year mark where, I was like, wow, I'm fucking hot.
I know what I'm doing.
I know what I'm doing, and I can handle any situation. Mm-hmm. And it certainly takes 10 years for anybody to get good in this business. I mean, but it takes 10 years to be a dentist or a doctor or a magnificent transmission repairman. Mm-hmm. And if you want to be the best transmission repairman in the world, you have to study the masters. And
that's right.
I'm sure as a dentist or a doctor, it's the same, you You have your masters that you learn from, and that's certainly in comedy. You have to study the masters. So, what are some of your favorite memories of watching me through the years as the proud uncle who inspired my career choice?
One of the happiest, this is a general thing throughout your career, one of the happiest, some of the happiest moments, let me put it that way, of watching you perform in comedy clubs would be, you would always get plenty of laughs and everything, but even comedians know this when you're up on stage on the laugh meter. Some nights you were a 6 and other nights you were a 7. You can tell by the loudness and the universality of the laughing, can't you? I mean, you can tell up there the degree to which you're killing. Don't you get a feel for that?
Certainly.
Okay. So the nights, though, when you were really destroying, I mean really just killing, one of the most joyous things for me that I would always do and sit around and look at all the other people in the club. And that would almost bring a tear to my eye sometimes. I would be so proud because I would look around and sometimes, depending on the club, it could be 100, it could be 300 people. And it's jammed. And I mean, virtually everybody in there is just in paroxysms of laughter. And I'm looking around, I'm going, I'm not saying it out loud, but that's my nephew up there, man, doing that, man. Look at what he's doing.
Happiness list number 6, Bill Murray. Bill Murray makes me happy because he's given me so many great moments in movie theaters. Stripes was a film that I absolutely loved. I love when he comes off the plane. A party? Who did this?
I'll kill you! Whose idea was this? Everybody's coming to my place. This is ridiculous.
One of my favorite films ever by Bill Murray is What About Bob? And I love it. And Richard Dreyfuss is he's this crazy guy in New York City who's afraid to go outside. And he only goes outside he's got a little fish bowl with a goldfish in it tied around his neck. And he's just so afraid. And he's walking and he keeps going, baby steps, baby steps, baby steps. Because that's what his psychiatrist, Richard Dreyfuss, told him to do. And then Richard Dreyfuss goes on vacation. And he just wrote a book and he goes to Vermont or New Hampshire or somewhere.
How many ways?
And Bill Murray follows him.
What I'd like you to do is to get on this bus and go back to New York.
I can't. I'm totally paralyzed. I'm all locked up.
You got yourself here.
Barely.
Well, getting back will be therapeutic.
But can't we just have a little talk?
Bob, you are testing my patience.
Come on. I've come so far.
Bob.
I'm baby stepping. I'm doing the work. I'm baby stepping. I'm not a slacker. Check it out. Look at I'm in really bad shape. Come on, please.
Bob.
Please.
Bob.
Give me. I need. Give me.
Okay.
Please.
And he comes, and Richard Dreyfuss just wants to be alone with his family and hates this guy. And it turns out his family ends up loving him. And everything he does just annoys Richard Dreyfuss. And there's a great scene where they're eating dinner, and he's just moaning. Just ridiculous how much he's loving this food, and the family's all cracking up. And Richard Dreyfuss is fuming. And then Richard Dreyfuss takes him out sailing, and he ties him to the mast of the ship. And there's a great scene where Bill Murray's all tied up, and he goes, "I'm sailing! I'm really sailing!" And of course, Richard Dreyfuss is trying to kill him. And Richard Dreyfuss tries to blow up his house and kill him. It's a ridiculous comedy.
Chicks dig me because I rarely wear underwear, and when I do, it's usually something unusual.
That this city is headed for a disaster of biblical proportion. Biblical. What he means is Old Testament, Mr. Mayor. Real wrath of God type stuff. Exactly. Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies. Rivers and seas boiling.
40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes.
The dead rising from the grave. Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
Enough, I get the point.
Is this true? Yes, it's true. This man has no dick. I smell vermin poontang. And the only good vermin poontang is dead vermin poontang. I think. I'm a god, and not the god. I don't think. But the real excitement, of course, is going to come at the end of the summer, during Sexual Awareness Week. We import 200 hookers from around the world, and each camper, armed with only a thermos of coffee and $2,000 cash, tries to visit as many countries as he can. And the winner, of course, is named King of Sexual Awareness Week and is allowed to rape and pillage the neighboring towns until camp ends.
Bill motherfucking Murray. This is the Steve Zissou remix. It was time for a quick change, so I had to rush more. I was on the razor's edge in this little shop of horrors. The man in the riddle swinging for some osmosis. Jones and Debbie Golden Globes award show hosts in slow motion. Space Jam, Michael Jordan to the max. One thing now that I'm a dynamite Caddyshack. Photon back charged up for some Ghostbusting twice. No marshmallow man in sight. Looming larger than life. Liquid sword, sound of iron and straps like a sergeant. Coffee and cigarettes, visages of Jim Jarmusch got me. Gargling arsenic coffee was miserable. Asking Richard Travis, what about Bobby Digital? Ignoring medical advice like my pals John and Gilda. With friends like these, who needs anything else to kill you? Nothing lasts forever, so it's tough to go home. I can't have that extinction where the buffalo roam. So I left the second city, next stop, Greenwich Village. Live from New York, it's Saturday night, top billing. Hero and Philly, now talking glory. Best of the videos now, catalog stories. Scene selection, scene-driven dreams whiz fast. A kingpin who's Scrooge, visiting Christmas past. Flipping back and forth, rerun sound the same. Pay dues and deja vu on every Groundhog Day. Down hallways and new shoes, or who's who people. Tootsie rolling backwards, feeling like a meatball. We're calling all the women that have passed through my hamlet. They get lost in translation, scarlet fever. Your hands are going to weaving romance. Feed and see more fresh goods. That screen and technicolor redirected airwood, redwood. Petrified when we start speaking of sex. All of Charlie's angels turn to demons and ex-girlfriends. Turn the tables, Dr. Van get shot. She's having a baby and the cradle will rock. Landlocked, life aquatic with loyal cast abound. Staying carpe diem like a royal Tannenbaum. Resting from the voyage, joining in videotapes. All soon go away as the mic runs to show kids. Old age is setting it. Honors to do proper. Coast of mine hosting when I should be winning Oscars. Yeah. Bill motherfucking. Yeah. Bill motherfucking. Bill motherfucking. Bill motherfucking. Bill motherfucking. Yeah. You know it's Bill motherfucking Murray. Yeah. Bill motherfucking. In no hurry. In no hurry. Yeah. You know why? It's Bill motherfucking.
My recollection of your style, and I only came up with this word because I saw it in Belgium. In Belgium, a lot of the comedians they have absurdist style, where they're just so all over the place, and I actually think it's very inventive, but I think it's probably one of the most dangerous styles that you could do to inhabit an animal's brain for a minute, and that was my recollection of your style, is that you were like an absurdist comedian in Belgium that I've seen, that it wasn't only monologues, it was you acted things out intensely, and you inhabited, objects and animals and things, and was very much like a cartoon when you were on stage.
That's true. I mean, I've done some drama and some acting and so forth, and so there is that kind of thing in me, and that would be my kind of approach, is just to take a premise, and then once I got into it, I could start ad-libbing or riffing or whatever. Now, I don't want anybody to mistake that I'm comparing myself to Robin Williams, and the genius that he
were very much like Robin Williams. But you were, in my opinion, you were very much like Robin Williams.
Had I pursued it, that was kind of my style. Yes, it was like to get up there and be manic and go wall to wall. My comedy was wall to wall, man, and it was all out. But it was acting out cartoon characters in your head. I remember a bit I used to do where I talked. What was just coming into being in technology was you would have cars that would talk to you, give you messages, close your door, and that kind of stuff. Machines would start giving you little messages, and I used to do a bit about automatic teller machines. What if they started having recordings to kind of talk you into that, talk to you while you were getting your money. And so I imagine different recordings, like if you were at Catholic University and you went to a teller machine, the teller machine would be called Father-O-Matic, because, of course he's got, he'd be saying, wait a minute now, laddie. Do you really need the money? Because I'm thinking, no, I'm not presuming to know your business, but I'm thinking you're probably going to go out on drugs and sex and so forth. Do you really want to spend your hard-earned cash? So that would be the lecture of Father-O-Matic. And, but at Howard University, an all-black university, it would be a whole different message, You'd be coming back, and the machine would be going, no, motherfucker, you ain't getting shit from me. You just hit 100, you were here an hour ago, bitch. You fucked up that $100 already? I don't think so. I ain't gonna give you shit. And so that was one of my bits of shtick that I did. But yeah, I would be absurdist and wall-to-wall about it, no question.
What do you remember from my beginnings in comedy? Because you've seen me from the beginning. And what are some of your most horrendous memories of me starting out as comedy? And what are some of your best memories of me starting out as a comedian? Following in your footsteps, I might add.
Well, the earliest recollections I have of you as a comedian, let me think. I didn't see you at the very, very beginning. You started as a junior or senior in high school, as I recall. When you started, I don't think I was around because you started when I was out of town, so to speak. But anyway, so then I'd start catching up with you at comedy clubs and everything. And a couple of my earliest recollections are how I don't remember the jokes per se. But you generally seem to have an affinity for it. You were smooth. As I recall, in those days, there were times when you wore a suit. Did you wear a suit at some earliest stages?
Sometimes,
yeah. And I seem to remember a shiny suit. It was like a silver shotgun suit or something like that.
It was the 80s, man, and I was...
I don't mean to dish you. You ain't got to explain to the people.
I've always been a clothes whore. I love clothing to this day. And certainly I've made many fashion mistakes.
No. Correct.
In the 80s, people were...
It was happening.
No, I remember wearing shiny suits with bolo ties.
And it was
at one point.
And you were looking good, baby. I'm telling you now.
Hey, speaking of the 80s, I get so sentimental when I drive past the Altamont Mall. I wish I could accumulate all the clothes I ever bought at the Altamont Square Mall and have one big fashion mistake garage sale. Oh my God. I left there happy with members only jackets. Fucking parachute pants. They're gonna love me if we don't hire any parachute pants. All right. Hey, look at my bald spot, everybody. Actually, that is not a bald spot. That is an old breakdancing injury.
So it's funny, you were talking about El Brookman's and that it was a country bar. And it shows you how, your memory of things can be very romanticized in your own brain. Whereas where I've always told the story, El Brookman's was a black club. and it was a predominantly black audience, and that was the way that I remembered it. And my father, your brother, took me to see you. I was 11, and we walked in, and there was a Shotgun Shack type of room.
That's right.
And the stage was next to the door.
Right.
And I was wearing a Washington Redskins jacket, and the comedian on stage grabbed me, pulled me on stage, and he interviewed me like I was the coach of the Redskins.
Okay.
And I was 12, and I gave bashful little one-word answers, yes and no, and
right.
could barely look up, but I do remember looking up and seeing the people's happy faces thrown back with laughter and all the teeth in their mouth. And that was the moment that changed my life. And then I sat at the bar with my dad and sipped Cokes, and I watched all these other comedians and then you. And that was the moment that changed my life. So my life has certainly been full of adventure, and I've had the most blessed and charmed life. And I certainly owe you all the thanks for that, because had you not tried to be a comedian in that period, who knows what I would be doing now. But it's funny that you clarified that it was actually a country bar and not a black club in D.C. the way I remembered it. Now, what do you think? Now, you only did it for a year,
more or less.
What do you think were the obstacles at that time, and why you didn't pursue it from there?
There were a couple things. The main obstacle, I'd have to say, I guess, if I was being perfectly honest, was myself. You know what I mean? I didn't have the dedication or the fire in the belly or the intestinal fortitude that you probably needed to withstand the rejection and the bombing. Now, I want to clarify one thing. I was talking about like how bad bombing was, because I remember bombing, but I did kill sometimes too, and that was incredibly exhilarating. So for the record, I want to say I did kill sometimes.
For the record, you've always been funny, and I've always considered you one of the funniest human beings I've ever known in my life. So, why you couldn't harness that? I mean, there was not the comedy club circuit that there was today. I think in any other, actually, I think if you would have started out in Belgium today, you'd be a fucking superstar.
Maybe I need to move to Belgium. Here's the deal, and why I'm absolutely, a person you could ask about Al Brookman's to double check if I'm, right about Al Brookman's being the very first place to start this kind of a comedy thing in D.C. Ask Rich Scheidner. He would know. But anyway, and Rich Scheidner came down there, but. So I remember, though, shortly after, what happened is Al Brookman's became hip, man. It became the in spot to go to. So like Georgetown high rollers and everything would start coming to little Al Brookman's that had been this little nothing redneck barfly haunted place, man. And suddenly it was the hot spot. And there were no other ones, because what happened was people would come to Al Brookman's, and you see this well-dressed crowd. And I remember one of the coolest moments in my little open mic exploits there of doing this and not, knowing what I'm doing or whatever. But I remember somebody said, they saw me like going up to the stage or something, and somebody whispered to somebody, "There he is." And that was the coolest thing, man. Somebody somewhere had actually recognized me and come back. They had told their friends, "Let's go see this dude.
There's that funny guy.
He's funny, yeah. He's funny." So that was one of the cool moments I remember. Anyway, but this well-dressed Georgetown kind of hip, upscale crowd started coming. So a buzz got out about Al Brookman's. And when it got out, then 6 months later or a year later, other comedy clubs started to pop up. There was one, I remember, in Georgetown somewhere. I don't remember the name of it or whatever. But suddenly, then it was like exploding. Every 6 months, there'd be another one. There'd be another one out of Crystal Village or whatever, Crystal City in Virginia or whatever. And suddenly there were 2 or 3 or 4. And I know that happened because Al Brookman, they had said, "Well, damn, you can do this. Look what's happening at Al Brookman's." And somebody really refined it. Instead of just starting one up on a whim in a redneck bar, they actually had a club specifically for that or whatever. So anyway, that was the dawn of that movement. But I kind of digressing there. I forget what our original topic was there, what we were talking about my memories of comedy and I remember.
What were the obstacles that kept you from going further? I mean, I know that there was not the comedy club chains that maybe if there would have been all the chain comedy clubs at the time when you started that there are now. Maybe you probably would have had a career in comedy. But take that away. What do you think kept you from going further as a comedian?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I don't, but I don't think that was it though. I think it was, I had a lot of other things going on in my life right then. At the same time, I was going to University of Maryland and trying to finish my classes out there. So I was doing this on the weekend and, whatever. And in between, and the time it takes to write an act or whatever, was taken away from my studies. My mother was also badly ill at the time. And so I was kind of looking after her. But that's kind of sounds a little bit to me, even to myself, of like maybe making excuses a little bit. The thing I think ultimately was, Tom, I wasn't thick-skinned enough. I wasn't thick-skinned enough to fight my way through the heckling and the rejection or the occasional bombing and stuff. It just the times that I killed was absolutely exhilarating, and I loved it. There's no cooler feeling, than to look out, man. And I mean, when I say killing, this room held 75 people jammed in there to the rafters or whatever. It was, like you said, it was this little shotgun bar thing, and maybe 100, but 75. But to see them almost as one organism explode into laughter at your joke, oh my dear Jesus, it was just the greatest feeling, and so forth, and I love it. But the rejection hurt so much, man. I mean, the times I bombed, and so it's just, if you can't get through that, you can't be a comedian. You know what I mean? You just got to get through that.
Yeah, it's really true. And the advice that, like, when comedians talk to me, and the young comedians, and they ask me for advice, a piece of advice that I always seem to be giving young comedians that I think is the truest to be a comedian is that you have to be your own best corner man. Mm-hmm. The way that Muhammad Ali had Bundini Brown.
Right.
You have to be, because there's so much in comedy especially. I mean, everything in show business is designed to hurt your feelings. But in comedy especially, there's so much rejection and humbling, dying experiences when you're starting out, the first 10 years especially, that you have to, be like a boxer's corner man for yourself. And, keep staying there, champ. Keep jabbing. Keep sticking, right. and don't give up.
One of the things we've talked about over the years is his career and everything. And the nature of show business is such that it's an ego-driven business, and comedy feeds your ego, and there's no question about it. So you have all these abstract ideas of success and measuring yourself. How successful am I? Am I a star? Am I a headliner or whatever? And so as you're growing and maturing, you kind of worry about those things, but you reach a certain age, and hopefully, if your head is screwed on reasonably tight, you realize that a level of success or whatever, or however you define that elusive term, that's not the end all and the be all of it. It's like living a life and being a decent human being, and keeping your body and soul together. Don't you think?
Absolutely, and I just realized one of my most proudest moments in comedy that I never realized before, because it was something I was always ashamed of. In the period after my sitcom was canceled, Mr. Rhodes, it ran 1996 to 1997 on NBC. 1998, I moved to New York City, and I was just hell-bent, and I was angry at humanity and show business and life and family. I had been taken advantage of by a few people. And a lot of my best friends in the business stopped taking my phone call. And I went into the toilet. I went into a tailspin. And I had always been really anti-hard drugs. I didn't even like marijuana when I started. That was something I got into later as I became a comedian, and it was something so prevalent in the camaraderie of comedy. And, hey, let's smoke a joint after the show.
Right.
When my sitcom was canceled, man, I really was angry at life and humanity. And I moved to New York City, and I had a ton of money. And I became all fucked up on cocaine, and I was doing tons of cocaine and ecstasy and whatever I could get my hands on. And I just realized one of my proudest moments of my career was in that 2-year period, 1999, I guess 1998, 1999, 2000 maybe. 2-3 year period, where I really became a fucked up mess because I was just so angry and bitter on drugs that I kept that away from my family. And I just realized that as much of a low point in my life as that was, I totally avoided the family whatsoever in that period. So I just realized that. But yeah, that was the most pathetic low point of my career, and I never, I moved to Holland, and I got lots of love there. And I had a great television career. And actually, Holland gave me my confidence back. Because if you saw me in 1998, 1999, I had no confidence. And I was Mr. Slump-shouldered guy, where on stage I had always been a prowling panther.
Right.
I had always been full of confidence. And just talking to you now, I realized that in that period where I went into the toilet, I totally avoided my family because I didn't want you to see that.
Sure.
But now, that's, that's 10 years ago now. I would never let anything affect me that severely as that did then. But that was because, I had my life was comedy, my life was show business, and it had disappointed me.
Sure, of course.
And it just, you're right. But for the most part, I think I'm one of the lucky people in that I love what I do, and I'm happy doing it now. But at a certain period, I did care about television, and I did care about what other people thought of me.
Sure, of course.
And when that became a disappointment, I completely spiraled out of control in drugs and self-hatred.
We've been talking about like the highlights and the good part and the wonderful part of comedy and so forth. But there's a dark side, man. And I've thought about it a lot. So whereas on the one hand, I'm flattered and honored in the sense that maybe I inspired you to do comedy and so forth. But comedy, if you're not careful, can take a huge toll on your soul. There's no question about it. And so, it's kind of a mixed blessing. I go, okay, well, Tom is having a cool life and getting to see and do all these things and everything. But I know goddamn well that comedy, not just for you, but for comedians in general, that's one of the worst occupational hazards of comedy, is becoming a bitter old comic. Because, everybody dreams of being a headliner or being a star or having their show or, and having big money and seven figures and all those things. I mean, let's not pretend that, we don't all kind of want that. We don't necessarily lust after it or whatever. But, and so you start to go, well, you see your life playing out or whatever. But not only that, but also being a comedian, when you're a comic and you're in the club and everything, basically people go to comedy clubs, it's kind of to party. It's a party of sorts, and you're the life of the party. You're the center of the party. You're the one that's making the party happen. And so the mood that you engender in the audience is like, what a cool fucking dude, man. He's funny. I want to party with that dude or whatever. And so you're going to get free drinks, free drugs, all of that stuff. And you can't traffic in that realm but for so long until it's going to do some damage, not just physically or whatever, but possibly to your soul if you don't keep it, in check or whatever. So there's that risk there. So, but the way to avoid that, as I see it, and the tough part of being a comedian, as I see it just from an outsider as a civilian, is you have to maintain enough discipline in your spirit and, a sound mind and a sound body or whatever. And it's extremely difficult to do because decadent shit is being presented to you all the time. Drugs, liquor, whatever. It's all there for the taking. And so it's only your own sense of self-discipline which if I had pursued comedy, God knows where I'd ended up when I was a wild dog in my 20s or whatever. I don't know if I'd have had the intestinal fortitude or the strength to avoid the temptations to a killer degree. You know what I mean? Who knows? But anyway, so that temptation is always there. But if you can keep your head together and be professional about it, you know, and be a solid human being, you can avoid that. And I think keep your career on check. And even if you never, you know, you don't get the movie deals or whatever, I don't even mean just you, but any comic, you know, who makes their way to a headliner or whatever, you know, don't covet those things. You know what I mean? Just say, well, you know, I'm making a good living, and you know, this is a cool way to make a living, and not let yourself just be too far drawn into the trappings or whatever. But so there's some dangers, you know, and some dark side to comedy.
What would be the greatest advice that you could give me now as a comedian or a man to live the rest of my life?
Believe in yourself and realize and know the richness of your life and how important your life is to me and many, many others that you've touched. This is way above and beyond just being a stand-up comic. Treasure the richness of the experience of the life that you've lived and know how important it is, and that you have a lot to say to this world and to give to this world, and that your soul and the fact that you're here, you were put on this earth, is extremely important, and that you are loved by more people than myself can possibly imagine. But never forget how important your life is, man, and what a good soul you are, and keep that part of you. Treasure it and keep it pure and keep it good. At those inevitable times when you or anybody will get depressed, I want you to always keep that, you know, in mind, of that you, how much you're loved and how important and impactful your life has been to people. I enjoyed the free beers you were able to throw my way. That was another perk. Another fucking perk. Because God knows you owed me a few since I was pumping you full of them at age 13. No, I wasn't. Sarah, that's his mother. If she hears this, I was not pumping your boy full of beer when he was 13. Tom, help me out here, dude.
You can play the game and you can act out the part, though you know it wasn't written for you. But tell me, how can you stand there with your broken heart, ashamed of playing a fool? But one thing can lead to another. It doesn't take any sacrifice. Oh, father and mother, sister and brother, if it feels nice, don't think twice. Just shower the people you love with love. Show them the way that you feel. Things are gonna work out fine if you only will. Do as I say. Shower the people you love with love. Show them the way you feel. Things are gonna be much better if you only will. Well, you can run, but you cannot hide. This is widely known. And what you plan to do with your foolish pride when you're all by yourself alone? Once you tell somebody the way that you feel, you can feel it beginning to ease. I think it's true what they say about these squeaky